I am joined today by Ben Wise. Ben is the founder of Storied, a US-based ghostwriting studio that helps 7+ figure founders turn their expertise and stories into compelling LinkedIn content in as little as 2 hours a month. Ben, thank you so much for being in my orbit and for joining me today on Couple of Conversations.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Awesome. Well, me too. And I want to talk today about brand messaging and ghostwriting. Before we do, I wanted to extend a huge congratulations crossing the milestone of $2 million in just 4 years of LinkedIn ghostwriting. That is incredible. You must be really proud of what you've built.
It does sound like a lot. I am and I'm not. I imagine I'm your typical dissatisfied or neurotically dissatisfied founder, I should say. Kind of more focused on finding flaws and areas for improvement rather than feeling pride and a sense of accomplishment at what I've built. So that's for good or for bad, that's how I'm wired.
Well, I think that I admire that you clearly check your ego at the door, but you have a lot of people like myself rooting you on from the sidelines and seeing a bit of ourselves in your journey. So speaking of
Oh, thank
journey,
you.
I would love to hear, how did you get to where you are today? So how did you get into content creation, ghostwriting, and ultimately how did you found Storied?
Yeah. How far back do you want to go?
As far back as you'd like. If you started storytelling and
I mean,
content
I
creation at
was,
3.
yeah, I was the kid who would like huddle under the blanket or the comforter with some kind of light and read when I was supposed to be sleeping just because I couldn't. If I was engrossed in a story in the narrative, I was like, no, I'm not. By the way, can I curse?
Of course,
I
do
was
it.
like, yeah, I was like, fuck you. I'm not gonna. I don't give a fuck that I need to sleep. I'm into the story, and I was, and then I was bullied in middle school, and so my way of coping with that was to go to the public library every day after school and check out like a book or two. It was mostly fantasy, but any storytelling I loved, and just to kind of get lost in the story for the rest of the day and imagine that I'm this, like heroic protagonist on this quest to kind of develop more and more abilities and defeat greater and greater enemies. While then in reality, I wasn't doing that well, unfortunately, at that point.
So how did you then take that poor tortured soul of a child who was pouring themselves into stories? How did that lead into this ultimately very successful career telling other people's stories too?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll focus on the biggest milestones. I think so. I've done a number of things in my life. When I was younger, I went into business with my dad for a bit, and that didn't work out. I was actually, fun fact, I was a woodworker. I made furniture for a while for a living. I was, yeah, a whole bunch of things. But I've always really loved reading and writing. I just kind of I suppose I didn't believe that one could make, or maybe I could make a decent living out of it. I think what changed that was becoming active on Quora, the Q&A platform, and I started writing. And pretty quickly, the content that I was putting out, the stories that I was putting out, didn't just go viral, but I actually had Quora's editorial staff or whatever, I don't know, reach out to me and say, hey, we have like Apple News or Yahoo News or Inc. or Newsweek. I had one, like they want to syndicate your piece. What do you think? And I was like, yes. Like I can now put that on my resume. Like I'm a published author. And then at the same time, I was freelancing. I was freelancing on Upwork, and I didn't like having to hunt for gigs. So what I did is I reached out to a bunch of agency founders that I knew and asked if they would have work for me as like a freelance writer. And one of them said yes, and they happened to do LinkedIn ghostwriting. And so the founder basically gave me his book of business so that he could then focus on growing the business. And I did really well. I mean, first of all, I was kind of blown away. I had no idea that LinkedIn ghostwriting was a thing. I mean, obviously I know about ghostwriting, right? Like I think ghostwriting has been around for millennia, right? For thousands of years. I'm sure like ancient, whatever, like kings or had someone write things on for them. There were a few concurrent revelations one of them was like, oh, this is a really cool way to make a living. I get to interview really smart, successful people, and I'm actually being paid to learn from them and then translate what they know into compelling content. And I think another one is that, oh, I'm actually pretty good at this, right? Like I have the EQ piece. I'm pretty good at making, maybe because I'm like vulnerable and self-deprecatory, people feel comfortable around me pretty quickly. But I'm actually good at letting these individuals lower, or allowing them to lower their guard and share interesting insights and stories, and then kind of translate them or kind of conduce that into content. And so I stayed there for a while, and then I decided to leave and do my own thing. And eventually I decided to actually like start a proper business. And that's kind of, I mean, feel free to ask more questions, but that's kind of like the truncated version of how I got to where I am.
Yeah. So, did you always want to work for yourself? Was that ultimately too baked into your vision for your life?
Not necessarily. I mean, I've always had like authority issues. I actually got kicked out of multiple high schools. I was a troublemaker, and I've always struggled to. I mean, especially if there was a rule that I interpreted as arbitrary, right? That didn't make sense to me. That wasn't like, oh yeah, I can use common sense or a thought experiment or whatever to ascertain that, yeah, that doing that is not a good idea, or here's why we should do this. But if someone was just like, hey, here's how we do things because that's how we've been doing things, or because that's the right way, and they weren't able to answer my question, I was kind of like, fuck you, I'm not going to do it that way. So I think that, so I wouldn't necessarily say that I always do that I would work for myself, but I would say that it's kind of, it makes sense that it happened that way given just the way I operate.
So, I would love to better understand. I think what's always confounded me about ghostwriting in general is about who is the author? Is it the person who wrote it or the person whose name is on it?
So as far as I'm concerned, they are the author. I'm not the author. All I'm doing is I'm the same as a contractor, or the same that when you build a company, you delegate different pieces of it to others, but it's your company, right? Like you, just because you hired someone to help you with marketing or operations or HR or whatever it is, right? Like obviously you want to give them credit for the excellent work that they do, but it's like it's yours. You're the mastermind. You're directing. You're also doing ideally a good job of leveraging their expertise and not kind of imposing your will, especially if you sense that they have that they know what they're doing and that you should let them do the work in the best way. But at the end of the day, it's just like it's your company, it's your content. All I'm doing is I'm helping to kind of transmit it, conduce it, in such a way that it'll get you results. But it's your ideas, it's your stories, it's all you.
Do you ever have any personal hangups when it comes to writing for someone else and not being able to put your name on it? Has it ever tugged at your heartstrings that it
Nope.
can't be in your
No, I
name?
love it. I love it. I I actually really enjoy being the man behind the curtain and seeing my clients get great results, and yeah, I really enjoy it. Like just last night, a lead came in, like a qualified lead came in for. There's only one client that I still write for, but I'm actually going to take on a few more clients myself. We can get to why later if that's interesting. But um, and last night, like a really great lead came in. Someone, I can't say too much because this client is under NDA, but someone who's like an ex, like someone very credentialed, like the lead, and she texted me, and we were both really happy, and I was like, fuck yeah, like I don't I don't need to take credit. Like I'm just happy that we got you this result. So for my personality, it actually works really well. And this may sound funny, but if it were up to me, I wouldn't even be on LinkedIn.
You wouldn't personally be on LinkedIn.
No. No.
I want to talk about LinkedIn, so I'm glad you brought that up.
I mean, that's kind of wild. That's kind of a wild thing to say, but
it is, and I want to dive into that more. But before I forget, I want to make sure I ask you. So, what is it like to adopt the voice of someone else, especially when it comes to someone who has a very distinct voice, or they're in a very niche, very highly specialized domain? How do you go about taking on somebody's voice?
So, at the risk of sounding persnickety, they're two very different questions. We have like one thing you asked about is voice and tone and channeling something kind of maybe a bit more ineffable. within someone, and that's one question. And the other question is, hey, how do you handle deeper subject matter expertise? Correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I'll start with the first, and I'll go to the second. So the reality is that either people don't really give a shit, and as long as the content is good and it gets them great results, they just don't care, or they're so persnickety that it's not a good fit. So like, I'm sorry, even if you pay me more, I don't want to work with you because you're going to nitpick. You're going to nitpick abstractions. Like what you're going to critique or criticize is so subjective that there's just no way, or it's going to be very difficult to agree on a shared reality of, hey, here's what the voice and the tone should be. I'm kind of oversimplifying it. I have developed ways over the years to kind of give clients more agency as to the voice and tone. So for instance, as part of our onboarding questionnaire, we'll ask like, how self-congratulatory are you? Or what do you feel about emojis? So we have different questions like that give us like an easy to agree on source of truth of like, hey, we're not going to use emojis here, or hey, this is someone who will never use profanities. Like I use, I had a shit post yesterday where like number 10 was give zero fucks about LinkedIn. Some clients are comfortable with that. I am, obviously. So that's a very easy way to give them agency and make them feel like, okay, someone cares and is trying to match my voice. But really, if you get someone who's like, well, this doesn't sound like me, and they're not able to pinpoint, they're not able to give you some kind of heuristic or framework or principle that's just easily applied moving forward. So there are reasonable requests and unreasonable requests. But really, at the end of the day, if it reads really well and it gets results, most people don't give a shit.
I appreciate that. And then what about the second part of the question about if they happen to be in a very, again, niche space or specialized industry?
So as much as people like to say, especially writers, that it's really great to have an outside perspective and to come into a subject fresh and that they can adapt and learn quickly, I actually believe that subject matter expertise matters. I believe that if you're gonna take as a client an aerospace engineer, I'm just wild example, and there's going to be like astrophysics and other like really like deep dense subject matter expertise involved, like you want to meet them part of the way, right? Like if someone's worked for NASA for 30 years, it's going to be extremely hard to match them all the way. But there's a kind of a sweet spot where you know enough, you have enough of a, shall we say, schema of what they do to be able, so that you're not they're not you could just click, like you're not wasting all this time with them educating you. I think the counter argument to that is that if you're someone who has deep subject matter expertise and you're looking for a ghostwriter and you work with someone who doesn't have that subject matter expertise, it'll force you to explain things in layperson terms that should be understandable by everybody. But that's hard to do. So I think ideally, like if I were looking for someone to ghostwrite my content, I would want someone who really knows their LinkedIn shit, right? Like I would want someone who really understands all these different pieces, because otherwise it's just going to, like, I'm just going to have to do a lot of education at the expense of actually talking about, sharing content and insights, ideas, stories. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I would love to hear it because this is kind of wild what you said about LinkedIn. So please tell me, why would you ultimately not want to be on LinkedIn? Because my questions around LinkedIn were like, what do you like about the platform? So tell me about LinkedIn.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I just want to add one more thing. I think I think you can take that as like one of the reasons why I think I'm able to do really good work for the client that I work with now personally. And also, like, one of the reasons I want to take on a few more clients is having walked in their shoes for a while, right? Like I'm a founder of, I've I read my P&L every month. I've had to develop systems. I've had to hire people and learn to manage, like all these things. I think that's just going to make me so much more or not I think, I know it's going to make me so much more effective ghostwriter for other founders. Like, I think it's going to, I mean, this is coming from someone self-deprecatory, but I really have an unfair advantage because most ghostwriters, unfortunately, they just kind of, oh, this is something really cool to do. And they put up a shingle. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's some exceptional ghostwriters. But I mean, if I work with someone where I both have like a decent degree of the subject matter expertise, and because I've walked in their shoes when they talk about the challenges of building a company or all that, like, anyway, I just wanted to put in a shameless self-plug there.
Oh, I'm excited for you. And I do think that gives you absolutely a competitive advantage and an empathy to the person you're working with so that you can really understand what their pain points are. And if they're targeting other businesses, if it's business to business, you're going to understand better what maybe their customer needs too from that lens.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, so I'm going to go back to your question about LinkedIn. I want to be thoughtful about how I talk about this, but I think that the fundamental problem with LinkedIn and actually social media platforms in general is that their incentives are not only not necessarily aligned with yours, but they can also be opaque. So I'll give you an example. People on LinkedIn, especially like influencers, talk a lot like, hey, here's how I've made it to this many followers, and here's how you do this, and here's how you do that. I don't think they really know what, like, I'm not saying they don't know at all what they're talking about, but I think there's a lot of like, hey, I made it. And even though I'm not really sure how, and even though the algorithm might have changed 4 or 5 times since then, and even though there are so many other pieces, like there's so many pieces there that it's have you read or seen a 3-Body Problem?
Mm-mm.
It's like it's a sci-fi book that's been turned into a Netflix show. I read the trilogy. It's really good. I like cerebral sci-fi. But anyway, the 3-Body Problem is something that's been around for a while. And it's when you have like 3 stars orbiting a planet, because of the like gravitational pull that they all exert at each other, it is nearly impossible to predict their movement, right? It's just the system is too chaotic. There's just like too many factors. And so over the years, scientists, physicists have tried to build different models that will predict like and to varying degrees of success, but it's just too hard. And so imagine how, like, think about how many factors, uncontrollable factors there are on LinkedIn. And then to add to that, like the algorithm it's opaque. It's like there are people who are sitting somewhere at Microsoft, LinkedIn, whatever, and are kind of thinking, okay, here's how we can monetize best. Here's how we can, like, here are business goals. And then they structure, build, or whatever, inform or feed whatever the algorithm accordingly. And then, but you don't know exactly what it is. Like you don't have access to that. You're kind of just trying to, and it's problematic. And this is, I mean, I think I'm also unusual as a ghostwriter, especially someone who's done this for 7 years, in that like, there are things I know really, really well and I'm very confident about, but there's things that are just mysterious and keep changing. And I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, you have people who kind of do some like put together big data sets. I think Richard what's his name? I mean, he has like the big LinkedIn report, and he really collates a lot of information and says, okay, if you have a picture, it's like X%, you get X% more impressions. And so we have some things that we kind of know, but there's a lot that's opaque, and that's frustrating. I mean, it can be frustrating. I think the other reason why, if I had the choice, I wouldn't necessarily be on LinkedIn. And again, this is like total like shooting myself in the foot thing to say, is because at the end of the day, I'm on LinkedIn because my livelihood depends on it, right? Because that's how I feed my family. But social media can be problematic in that it causes you to compare yourself. It's a time suck. Again, I've talked about some of the other issues. So it's just like, I'm not sentimental about it. If I somehow figured out that I'm the sole heir of like an extremely wealthy uncle I didn't know about, or if all of a sudden I just didn't have to, I would probably prefer to do things that I enjoy in real life. Like, no offense, like, spend time with people I love. So to me, I think that's also important. It's like a good segue to another point that I want to make is like LinkedIn is a tool. It's a means to an end. It shouldn't be the end, right? Like if you're a 7-figure founder, I think, especially B2B, it makes a lot of sense to run the test, whether you're doing it yourself or you're paying a ghostwriter or whatever, of like, hey, let's say decide that I'm comfortable spending between 10 to 15,000 over X months to just prove this or not. If you prove it, if the ROI is positive and you can, and you're getting leads, you're getting podcast invitations, whatever it is, like, awesome, just keep doing it. Just like, hey, here's another channel that I invest in. And if it's not, just like, okay, I tried this, at the end of the day, it's marketing, put your budget somewhere else or whatever. But like, I don't like it when people are sentimental about it, right? Like at the end of the day, it's one of the biggest corporations on the planet and they're just trying to make more money. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. Like, you're not special. Like, does that make sense? I hope it doesn't sound too fatalistic.
No, I appreciate it because Ben, from an outsider's perspective, when I look at your posts, I would say sentimental is the wrong word, but they're extremely emotive. And it's enough to make the reason I reached out to you is like, wow, this guy gives, as you say, zero fucks and is ultimately very candid about some very personal subject matters as well, not just professional and building storied and how you're helping these 7+ figure founders. And so I've always, from an outsider, I'm surprised to hear this because it seems like it's a platform that's also bordering on cathartic in a way that how I read it for you. But I've totally, again, this is me coming with my preconceived notions
that's a
or
really
assumptions.
great observation. That's a really great observation. So I'm reading a really interesting book now called Filter World: How Algorithms Flatten Culture, which is kind of terrifying. But there's this phenomenon where this feedback loop. So for something to go viral and perform really well, it needs to have a pretty low common denominator, right? Because I think that's self-explanatory, but to spell it out, it needs to appeal to enough people for it to attain that virality. So one way in which I see that flattening on LinkedIn is that you have influencers, or you have a lot of people who, let's say, write like very trite and platitudinous, like, just keep going, and you're wonderful and whatever. And it's like, I don't feel it's sincere, but I don't blame them, because there's this feedback loop where you kind of learn what the algorithm likes and then you give it to it so that you're rewarded. But that in turn shapes the algorithm to kind of give that more distribution. And that's the flattening, right? That's like how people, that's why one of the things I don't like about LinkedIn, speaking of pet peeves, is that there's a lot of content that you can show me and I'm like, this has zero personality, or I have no idea who wrote this. It's just like formatted it just right so that every line is exactly the same or has something like that. And it's like, like the hook, and it works, which I think is problematic. So I think, to your question, like, if I'm going to be on LinkedIn, I need to do my own fucking thing, right? I need to make it mine, or it's not going to be sustainable. And again, maybe that ties into like the authority issues. I'm like, fuck you. Just because everybody's putting out these platitudes and that's what performs really well, it doesn't mean I don't want to. For me, it's selling out. I'm not saying it's selling out for others. So it's true, it is cathartic, but it's like, if I'm doing it, I need to make it mine, and whether it's mine because I'm sharing expertise that I worked very hard to acquire and I feel can be both helpful to others, but also help me win new business, or just like being raw and honest and vulnerable about, like, it's just that's important. I don't think I'd be able to do it otherwise, or maybe I would, and I would have to habituate, but I don't know. Is that like, that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but does that help you understand where I'm coming from?
You brought up, okay, so regarding vulnerability, before we move off of this, I want to know, how do you walk the line of being vulnerable and oversharing? Because I've seen posts that, to me, I look at as an overshare, but everything's relative, right? Like, that isn't something I would share, but
yes,
I also admire at times the courage. And then there's another part of me, if I can be so frank, is to say, that makes me totally cringe. And I think, ooh, that's just an attention-seeking thing.
I call it vulnerability porn.
Yeah.
I'm good. I didn't have to know that. Like, whoa. Keep that in the bedroom.
Yes. How do you walk that line? It's very difficult, I think, for people to know what's vulnerable and relatable versus what's cringeworthy,
Yeah.
repulsive, and an overshare.
So I think the simplest principle, and I believe this comes from Brené Brown's work, is share scars, not open wounds. All right. So if your company is imploding, if your marriage is unraveling, you know, if God forbid one of your kids just became a junk, like maybe keep that to yourself for now. Like wait until there's a resolution. You know, wait until you've navigated the crisis or whatever it is. You're on the other side of it. You're in a better place and you have some lessons to share. So instead of kind of being a victim, you're like, hey, here's this really fucked up thing that happened and it was awful. And here's the story. And here's how I resolved it. And here's what I learned from it. And I think that's especially important if you're a business owner. On the one hand, you don't want to project as this like wooden figure, you know, with like zero life and personality. But on the other, you don't, it's still a professional platform. Like if you have a big problem right now with your ops or retention or whatever it is, like you don't want to broadcast that. That's not going to be helpful. That's not going to, I don't think that's a good idea. But if you fixed it, if you're like, hey, 3 years ago we had this huge problem and it was fucking awful, but then here's what I learned and here's how we do things differently now. Like that's a battle scar. That's not an open wound.
I appreciate that distinction. Also, something that Brene Brown talks about is there has to be some trust between the teller of that and the recipient. It's like when you don't know anybody, you don't know the person, in front of you, and then you're sharing those open wounds.
Yeah.
It's repulsive because they haven't earned the right to hear that. And so you shouldn't be sharing it. And so in a lot of ways too, I think if you've built as an influencer, which maybe you hate this, but I think you're an influencer I'm sorry, but you have tremendous influence on LinkedIn. And so, but I feel like you've built a trust with your audience. You're not for everybody. You say fuck, you share personal details, you ultimately welcome people into your journey. But again, I think professionally that people aren't worried. Are you okay? Like, is the business okay? But I feel like you've built up that kind of trust with your audience where people, you're not opening your coat in the buck. Like you're ultimately welcoming people in a very kind of controlled fashion. Do you find that LinkedIn has also become a platform where people, in an attempt to be more vulnerable, and there's a lot of this, oh, woe is me. And I want to know, how would you, because that's a lot of people in my orbit who've lost their jobs. Not everybody is doing that kind of thing, but how would you encourage people to alter that so that they're attracting the right attention? Because most of those people, by the way, who do that don't get jobs from that. That's unfortunately not the result.
Yeah. I mean, this is the caveat that I'll issue is that I know less about this. These are not people that I work with, right? Like my jam is really other founders because I've done it for many years, because I've walked in their shoes. And so that's a place where I feel very confident. So having kind of placed that caveat, I think it's really a similar principle where you can start with just how much it fucking sucks. But instead of pandering to this us versus them or this, I mean, this is a little side tour, but I'm kind of dumbfounded by the fact that, like, do people still think there's something sentimental about business? Like, I'm sorry to say this, but like business is fundamentally transactional, right? Like and this is coming from someone where if someone is only like, I might decide not to work with people if they're only transactional, but there's a difference. Like the base is transactional, right? Like you render a certain service and you're paid for it, or vice versa, right? Like, and if any, like just anyway, that's a totally different rant. But it's like, can we please grow up and be adults? Like this is how the world works. Like, sure, you might have some qualms with late stage capitalism, but that's what we've got, right? And it sure beats communism. Like I tried that, didn't go very well. Anyway, but rant aside, like use the emotion and vulnerability to draw the reader in, and then navigate away from that to your abilities, what you bring to the table. Like show some grace and dignity, right? Say, you can make it personal. You can say, this is extremely painful, but don't tie your identity to that. Like, don't become the person. Just pivot away from that and say, here's what I've learned. Here's what I bring to the table. Here's what I'm looking for in my next role. And that. So sure, leverage that vulnerability, maybe some of like the sympathy that would garner, but don't stay there. Don't stay in that victim place. Move on and actually demonstrate how you can bring value by talking about what you've learned, the accomplishments, and show resilience. That's a good opportunity to show resilience.
I agree. Well, thank you for sharing that. And my last question for you today is, when it comes to successful marketing, from your perspective, when it comes to founders who are growing their business and attempting to reach customers, what do you think the struggle behind being successful comes from? Is it a lack of systems and discipline to do the type of outreach, the appropriate type of marketing? Or do you think it's a fundamental lack of understanding of who they're marketing to? Or is it both?
It can be both. I mean, I think there's another piece that not a lot of people talk about, or not enough people talk about, that, again, this is where I'm probably kind of controversial, but a lot of business is luck.
No.
Like, a lot of business is luck, like I'm doing all right, but I had I'm just quick anecdote, and then I'll answer your question kind of more thoughtfully. But I happened to be connected to someone who got a job at JP Morgan. You may have heard of that.
Yeah.
You have heard of it? And he was trying to bring me in, and that's like, it didn't materialize, but that's like one kind of totally luck dependent happenstance that if it had come through, I might be driving a very different car right now. So I think that one thing that we need to normalize is the fact, and again, this is another thing that I don't like about LinkedIn, and kind of like the kind of incentives and the algorithm that people present as if like they know everything, because that tends to do well. Right? Like, authoritative content. Here's exactly what you did. You don't fucking know that to a T. Like, maybe, yeah, like that could work. Some good advice there. So I think, yeah. So having put that aside, look, I think if you're running a business, then first of all, the best thing that you can do is give your customers a good experience, make it enjoyable to work with you, and get them results. Right? Like, that's the foundation. And word of mouth is the best way to grow, because it's just very easy to close someone. If you're doing exceptional work, like we have a client we started working with this year. She's wonderful. We've gotten her great results. Already 2 converted referrals of just like, just people seeing her content and going like, whoa, what the fuck is it? Like, when did you become, when did your profile become so spiffy? And, what is this really nice content? Oh, actually, I'm working with someone. Okay, cool. I'm also interested. So already 2 converted clients. So that's the best. And then I think it's a question of scale. Like, that may not be enough, or because of macroeconomics, you might have to. And then I think it's just being like, again, not being sentimental, and you just need to test. Like, is it podcast sponsorships? Is it paid ads? Is it social media? Is it PR? Like, you just have to be very disciplined about running these tests. So finding really good vendors, because if the vendor isn't good, then you're not going to learn anything from the test, right? But finding really good vendors, unless you're doing it yourself, and just being very disciplined and almost rigorous, right? Like saying, okay, I'm going to spend this amount of time, this amount of money, and just kind of on the other side of that, and then just not being sent. And that's why I tell clients, like, I can't guarantee you results. This is a higher risk, higher reward. Like, we may knock it out of the park and continue to generate leads and wonderful opportunities, or it may not work. But what we can do is we can both agree that this is what the test looks like. This is what the results should look like for this to be worthwhile, for this to be worth your money, and even down to like how many leads or how many click-throughs or whatever, if possible, and just test. And if it doesn't work, move on and conduct another test until you find something that works for you, with the caveat that landscapes change, right? So you have to adapt. But yeah.
That's great. Well, I appreciate that's very sage advice coming from you. And for a new founder like myself, I've done a lot of tests and iterations. And I think, to your point, removing some of the sentimentality from it helps. It's his business and things evolve and change. And so thank you for that. I guess I know that was my last question, but I do have one more that I want to kind of wrap up with. As
That
you
was your
mentioned
penultimate last question.
I know I'm dragging it, but I'm so curious because you brought it up at the beginning and it's been in the back of my mind, but you said that you're going to start taking on more ghostwriting clients. And I'm curious why and what are you excited about? I guess as a sort of final question, like what's on the horizon for the rest of this year? Maybe,
Yeah.
Along with that.
So I'm actually going to write about this soon. And this is, again, maybe controversial, but I've actually decided to stop scaling for the moment. Yeah, it's basically what I've been doing is making like good money, investing a lot of it back into the business to build like better systems and all these things. And it's been great. It's worked well. But I kind of want to take a break from that right now. I have a 10-month-old. I have a lot going on. I also think that, like, speaking of humanizing business, I think human beings are kind of seasonal, if that makes sense, right? I had like a really strong push, and now I'm like, no, I actually don't. I'm not that I'm never going to scale again, but I actually want to just kind of keep things a bit tighter and just kind of more easily manageable, and just kind of like rest where I am for a while. Which means that I have because I'll be focusing less on actually trying to like build and scale. I'll have more time to take on a couple more clients myself, which I'm excited about because, yeah, I think for the right person or for the right people, I can deliver good results. So again, that's another place where I'm like, if you build a company, the expectation is that you just keep scaling. Like, what are you, an idiot? Like, why wouldn't you keep making money? Sure, but like scaling and building is very stressful, right? Like the bigger something is, the more moving parts, the more complexity, the more things beyond your control, the more stressful. So that's why I'm going to take a couple clients, because I'm just decided to. I have kids. I have this 10-month-old. I want to be more available. I want to be in a better headspace, and running a business can be extremely stressful.
Yeah. Well, good for you, Ben. I think that's an excellent way of putting it. Life has seasons. And I think if you ignore the season you're in and just push through, I think they call that burnout. So I'm really glad
I've
that
experienced that a number of times, and it's not a great feeling.
No, so I mean, again, you've just recently crossed this big milestone, and I think you should be very proud of what you've built to date, and also proud,
Thank you.
Of listening to yourself, because I don't think too many people do that, and they run the risk of either burnout or feeling like they've got more wounds than scars. So I'm very grateful that you joined me today on Couple of Conversations. I'm so glad that you're in my orbit, and thanks to LinkedIn. So as much as we've shit on the platform, but thanks to LinkedIn, I got a chance.
I just want to clarify. I'm very grateful. Like if it weren't for, like, I've made a lot of money and a lot of good things thanks to LinkedIn. I'm just, like, as you've seen, I'm just like not very sentimental and pragmatic about things, and I just wanted to, like, I get drinking the Kool-Aid, but like it's a double-edged sword, and I just want us to be adult and sober about it, rather than kind of like, oh, LinkedIn, like. I'm not an acolyte of the cult of LinkedIn.
Neither am I.
It's a tool.
It's
a super powerful tool, but that's all it is. It's just a tool.
I agree. But I'm grateful, like I said, to that tool for bringing you into my life and for the chance to get to know you better, watching your posts and leading up to today. And then obviously today's conversation. So thank you so much for joining me today.
That's very kind of you. And the sentiment is mutual.